Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, is the cost of living really getting worse? Should artworks be classified in the same way as movies? And a new report claims that industry is crying wolf over the carbon tax. Our panel tonight, Tim Wilson from the Institute of Public Affairs, Damian Smith from Rate City, and our political editor, Lyndal Curtis. Well, another industry has put its hand up for carbon tax compensation. 19 major food and grocery companies have signed a letter to the Prime Minister warning that the sector needs protection from possible job losses. Chief Executive of the Australian Food and Grocery Council, Cannane, says the industry is already under pressure from the high dollar and the carbon tax will make things worse.
A lot of our manufacturers do use a lot of power, therefore their prices will be affected. That means their competitiveness on Australian supermarket shelves and in the export market will be affected. The government really has to take this on board when they model this tax.
Climate Change Minister Greg Combet says industry should stop making a tax on the carbon tax publicly and start negotiating with the government.
It is important for people in the business community to understand that the government is committed to making this reform, and it's better off being inside the room, talking these issues through and trying to get the best possible outcome.
But Shadow Finance Minister Andrew Robb says when it comes to pricing carbon, the government won't be able to keep business or unions happy.
Got the unions on Friday saying, you know, they won't put up with a situation where one job is lost. Well, of course, under the previous model, the CPRS, the estimates were of jobs in the order of 126,000 in regional Australia alone. So clearly there are going to be hundreds of thousands of jobs lost. So the union's demand cannot be met.
Lyndal, how significant is this letter sent to the Prime Minister today?
Well, I think it adds to the pressure on the government to get the design of the carbon price and the emissions trading scheme that follows it right. And in some senses, it's significant because it's adding more voices to the call for not only export industries to be protected, but now industries that compete with imports to be protected as well. And this, along with the statement from the Workers' Union boss, Paul Howes, that he doesn't want to see one job lost or he'll pull support for the tax, is setting the bar quite high from the government. I think probably one of the signals that things aren't going as well as they might is some of those people, or the Food and Grocery Council says the problem is they don't feel like they're being heard within the negotiations on the business roundtables that the government set up. The government really needs that process to go well and for agreement to come out of that process to come up with a scheme that then business can support, or else it will be continuing to fight even when we have more detail of what's included in the scheme.
Tim, I know you have been doing some very serious carbon accounting recently, judging by your piece in the Oz today. Now, is the carbon tax really going to have that much impact on groceries?
Well, I mean, we ultimately don't know how much an impact will have till we have the price. But what we do know, and I think what's really important about the action by the Australian Food and Grocery Council today, is that it's undermining the spin of the government. The spin of the government is it's hitting the big polluters, the big polluters, the big polluters. Who are the big polluters? I think most people understandably think that's the mining companies, the electricity companies, but not only is it those companies, it's also food manufacturers. It's also the supermarkets who both directly get hit with a carbon tax, but of course are big consumers of electricity and therefore double hit with a carbon tax. And so it has a very significant impact in terms of the government's position and its saleability of their argument to the public.
It's right, we don't know what the price is going to be, but there's been speculation it could start with $20 per tonne. And if that was the case, according to Treasury modelling, then groceries would only go up by 80 cents a week.
Well, that's the start price, and this is the other challenge for the government.
But 80 cents a week's not that much in an average family budget, is it? 80 cents a week
isn't a huge impact, but it also goes into lots of other things beyond just groceries, on top of price rises anyway because of droughts and now floods, and, you know, bananas aren't cheap if anybody's gone and bought them recently. But the other challenge, and the government needs to have an open dialogue with the public about, is this tax goes up. every single year. And so, yes, it might start out at 80 cents, but they're continuing to increase it and they claim compensation, but they have a real...
Well, I think if it went up to $30, it'd be $1.20.
Well, it would also flow through to lots of other expenses throughout the economy. So the cost of living pressure would be on lots of different people, and it also depends on both the compensation package, but also the other things that people buy, and so it has a very big impact.
Damian, is this more trouble for the government, having the grocery industry calling for compensation as well?
Oh, look, I think, unfortunately, like a lot of things with this government, it has not managed a debate terribly well. But, the bottom line is there is a price on carbon today. I know Tim, as a good old-fashioned libertarian, is going to deny that there's any such thing as an externality in the world. But there is a price on carbon right now. It's just not borne by the people who emit excess amounts of it. That price on carbon is borne by the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's being borne by future generations who pay directly in some ways over their lifetimes for what we're doing now and what we've been doing for the last 20 years. Putting a price on that, whether that's through a tax or a market mechanism, I actually don't care, but putting a price on that is actually the best economic way of transferring that cost from future generations to having some of it borne now.
Damian, also, it was interesting that Paul Howes has made comments about this. He says the union support for a carbon tax would be withdrawn if it threatened one job.
Yeah, and look, I don't doubt that as it stands, Paul Howes is both representing the current consensus of his senior leadership around the AWU. He's probably also playing the correct negotiating game, which is politically correct. I think he's wrong. I've always been, as someone who started life as a centrist social democrat and plans to finish their life as a centrist social democrat, I think Paul Howes' journey from Trotskyite youth to right-wing populist union leader troubles me. The fact that it's a path that's the only other person I know who have trod that path is Michael Costa, says to me, I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with this guy.
OK, Lyndal, apparently 7 of the government's hand-picked 15-strong advisory group are signatories to this letter that went to the PM today, and they're due to meet with a few of the government ministers tomorrow. What will that meeting be like?
Yes, well, it'll make for a very interesting meeting indeed. I think having put this letter out, there may be some strong words exchanged in the industry roundtable group tomorrow, but really what the government needs is to try and manage this process. It's been seeking to reassure, last week we saw it was trying to reassure households that they get compensation for this. It's been trying to reassure the unions that it's listening to the concerns particularly of the steel industry. That was something that Paul Howes particularly raised, and it needs to reassure industry that it's listening as well. I guess the question is how much of this is ambit claim from both industry and the unions as the process of consultation goes through, and how much is lines in the sand that they're not prepared to cross. I guess we won't know that till the final scheme comes out. But certainly I think on the question of Paul Howes and expressing his concern, from what I understand, he was reflecting the concerns that are coming from his members. Now they are working population, they are ordinary Australians, and that I think is, and what we saw today from the polls as well, is that the government hasn't convinced the public that it's doing the right thing. And I think the question is the government's got to find a way to keep the public listening as it goes through the process of putting this together behind closed doors. We're not going to see the details of the scheme for at least a couple of months. We may not see the carbon price till even later.
Well, the government has another fight on its hands if a plan to means test the childcare rebate goes ahead. According to reports in News Limited papers on the weekend, the government is considering stopping the 50% refund of costs for households with a combined income of between $150,000 and $200,000 a year. The Treasurer has refused to rule out the changes in the May budget, but childcare groups and unions are warning against the cuts. Paul Howes from the AWU says he's opposed to the idea because it discriminates against women returning to the workforce.
One of the lowest levels of workforce participation in the OECD. It makes no sense to me to restrict the childcare tax rebate based on what a woman's husband earns. In my view, we should be doing all we can as a country to be getting women into work when they want to work.
So is this an area of middle-class welfare that needs some fat trimmed, or is it unfair discrimination against women who want to return to the workforce? Tim, what do you think?
Well, it's in reality a mix of both, but the problem ultimately with these sorts of rebates is they don't actually address the root cause and problem for childcare service provision in the country, which is to increase the volume of supply to bring down prices. You know, all those market-based supply-demand mechanisms actually have a big impact, and so that's what actually matters. What these rebates do is just increase the price that it costs for people to buy these services. And I mean, on principle, I agree that people shouldn't just be judged based on, particularly women.
But if you cut out a rebate, like the 50%, would that suddenly drop the cost of childcare by 50%?
Well, no. Once the prices are set and they're continually inflated by government, it's unlikely to do so. The only way you're going to see that is either through increased competition, which primarily happens as a consequence of supply, because there's already plenty of demand. But I do think that there is too much middle-class welfare across the government, and that means testing is not a bad thing at all. What the rate is, ultimately we see, but this only encourages more consumption rather than increasing the amount of supply.
Damian, there's fears this could drive skilled women out of the workforce. What are your thoughts?
Look, you know, I think Tim makes actually a pretty fair point. I mean, the challenge, he's absolutely right. These things don't add to supply. It's a similar kind of problem to first homeowners grants. They
just gave the money to the vendor,
exactly.
Didn't it?
So I think the challenge is, Tim's absolutely right, the price won't come down quickly in response to removing these rebates. So there will be a group of people who'll be substantially worse off next year with no ability to negotiate with a childcare provider to get the price down. Look, my old mentor, Bruce Chapman from the ANU, invented a scheme called HEX for Australia, which has found its way around the world. Income contingent loans, on the principle that there are times in people's lives when they don't have money and need it, and there are times in their life later when they have got more money and they can pay it back. I think there's a strong argument to be looking at some kind of income contingent scheme here that says, OK,